Welcome, wherever you are listening from tonight. Maybe you've settled in under the dim light of a lamp. Or maybe you're lying in bed with only the glow of your phone to push back the dark. However you've arrived here, I need you to do something. Picture yourself on a frozen dock in New England more than 2 centuries ago. The year is 1807, and in Provincetown harbor, a ship is drifting slowly back from the sea. But this is no triumphant return, no homecoming filled with cheers and church bells. This ship, the Empress of the waves, slides into port like a ghost. Her sails are torn, her timbers scarred, and her cruets left of them stand like shadows at the rails. They don't wave to the townsfolk waiting on the docks. They don't sing the old songs. They don't even speak. They simply stare with eyes that look more animal than human. The people of Provincetown know the sea can take men in storms, in sickness, in hunger. But what they see that morning goes beyond drowning or disease. These men have survived something worse than death. Their faces are sunken, their clothes are stiff with blood and brine, and when one of them finally stumbles ashore, the stench that follows him makes the townsfolk recoil. It is the smell of rotting flesh, not fish, not whale, something else. The whispers spread instantly. They've eaten each other. The words echo through taverns, across wharves, into church pews. Nobody dares ask the men directly, but the way they clutch their bellies and the way their eyes dart when meat is mentioned is enough to confirm what no one wants to say aloud. The Empress of the waves has brought home survivors, yes, but at the cost of their humanity. This isn't just a story about a shipwreck or starvation. This is about what happens when men are pushed past the breaking point. When the cold Atlantic turns a voyage into a coffin, and when hunger sharpens into madness so strong it eats away not just at the body, but at the soul. Stay with me tonight because this story is one that New England tried to bury. The town wanted it forgotten, the records burned, the families silenced. But bones don't lie, and journals don't rot as quickly as guilt. The truth is that the Empress of the Waves became one of the earliest and most chilling cases of cannibalism at sea in American history. Tale so disturbing that even whalers' men who faced death every day refused to speak of it. Before we dive deeper, I want to know where are you listening from and what time is it in your corner of the world? Drop it in the comments. These stories become more than just echoes of the past when you bring them into the present. And if stories of survival, horror, and forgotten history are your kind of night, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button, because the tale of Provincetown's cannibal crew is only the beginning, and we have many more shadows to walk through together. Now, let's return to that dock in February of 1807. The ship is silent, the harbour is still, and the town of Provincetown is about to learn that the sea can give back men who are alive, but not truly living. The first official report of the Empress of the Waves' return was brief, only a few lines in a Boston shipping log. It noted a Provincetown vessel, much diminished in crew, arrived in poor condition, but what those few words could not capture was the horror in the eyes of those who saw her limp into harbor. At first, the townspeople thought they were seeing another shipwreck survivor story, the kind New England had grown used to. Whaling was brutal work. Ships were lost every year to storms and ice, and every family in Provincetown had at least one empty chair at the table. But this was different. This was not a story of drowning or freezing. It was a story that carried itself ashore in the eyes of the survivors and in the terrible weight of the silence between them. Children who had run to the docks expecting fathers or brothers to come home were instead pulled back by mothers who whispered prayers under their breath. One woman fainted when she saw the men, swearing later that she had smelled human fat on the wind. The ministers who stood in the crowd offered blessings, but their hands trembled as they made the sign of the cross. They knew without being told that something unholy had returned with this crew. The survivors did not rush into the arms of their families. They did not ask for food or water. Instead, they lingered near the gangplank, eyes darting to the crowd, searching for judgment. A few stumbled forward, but their movements were stiff, mechanical, like men who had forgotten how to walk on land. And when one of them tried to speak, his voice cracked into a rasp that silenced the dock. The words he managed to force out were simple. It was the sea. The sea made us do it. But everyone knew that wasn't true. It hadn't been the waves, or the storms, or the empty barrels below deck. It had been them. Whispers spread quickly that some of the men who boarded the Empress of the Waves months earlier had never returned. The passenger list no longer matched the survivors. Questions formed where were the missing crew? Had they been buried at sea, claimed by illness, or something worse? The answers were sealed in the blood-stained planks of the weir, in the half-burned logs that spoke of dwindling supplies and measures taken. Provincetown was not a place of strangers. Everyone knew everyone else, and that made this horror cut deeper. These weren't nameless sailors. They were husbands, sons, neighbors. And yet, by the time the ship returned, they had crossed a line that no community could accept. To kill was one thing. Men at sea sometimes fought to the death. But to eat, to carve, to roast, to consume one of their own was something that even the harshest sea could not excuse. The town's elders tried to bury the story. They warned against gossip, urged families to accept the men home quietly, and pushed ministers to preach forgiveness. But whispers are stronger than sermons, and soon taverns all along Cape Cod buzzed with talk of the Provincetown cannibals, of men who had chewed human bone in the cold and come back with a hunger that never left them. And here's the unsettling truth. The story didn't end with their return. The voyage of the Empress of the Waves left behind fragments, bones washed ashore, rumors of secret burials, and entries in a ship's log that no one wanted to read aloud. Some claimed the men made a pact never to speak of what happened. Others whispered that they had tasted something they couldn't forget. This was more than survival. This was transformation. Men who went to sea as whalemen came back as something else entirely. Stay with me as we follow the trail back to where it began, when the ship first set sail, when the crew still laughed and sang, and when none of them could imagine how hunger would hollow them into monsters. Because the sea doesn't just take lives. Sometimes it gives them back but changed in ways too dark to name. Provincetown at the start of the 19th century was a town on the edge of everything. On the edge of the Atlantic, where storms could rise without warning and where winter ice could cut the harbor off from the world. On the edge of poverty, where families lived one failed voyage away from starvation, and on the edge of faith, where men and women prayed to a God they feared might not be listening. The town itself was little more than a handful of crooked streets and weather-beaten homes clinging to the sand. Nets hung from fences to dry, sails patched and repatched fluttered in the wind, and the air always carried the same mix of tar, brine, and smoke. Children learned early not to fear the ocean because fear was a luxury no one could afford. They learned to swim before they could read, to gutfish before they could write. Every boy grew up with one eye on the sea and one hand reaching for the harpoon. Whaling was the town's lifeblood and its curse. It brought money, oil, and a strange kind of pride. But it also took men by the dozens. For every ship that returned laden with barrels of whale oil, another was lost to storms, ice, or the sheer violence of the hunt. Families accepted this grim arithmetic because there was no other choice. The soil of Cape Cod was too thin for crops, the forests too sparse for lumber trade. The sea gave or it withheld, and Provincetown had no other master. Into this harsh rhythm came the Empress of the waves, a ship already worn from years of service, but still deemed fit for one more voyage. She was no grand vessel. Her decks were scarred, her masts splintered in places, and her hull carried the stains of countless voyages. But she floated, and she could carry men into the Atlantic in search of whales. And that was enough. The man chosen to command her in 1806 was Captain Elias Harding. At 42, Harding had salt in his blood and scars across his body that told of storms survived and hunts narrowly won. His reputation was mixed. Some called him steady, others said hard. He was not a man to waste words. He demanded obedience, kept discipline with a cold eye and a steady hand, and gave little thought to what his men thought of him. But he had something more important than popularity experience. Harding had led voyagers north into the ice, south into the tropics, and across the violent mid-Atlantic where storms could tear a ship apart in hours. When Harding began assembling his crew, men came forward for reasons as varied as their faces. Some were locals, sons of Provincetown, who had been to sea since they were boys. Others came from further inland, drawn by desperation when farming or trade failed. A few were strangers from ports like New Bedford or Nantucket, wandering sailors chasing wages wherever they could be found. Each man signed his name. Moore scratched a crude X if he couldn't write in the shipping office. Once that mark was made, there was no turning back. The crew numbered around 24. Among them were young green hands, barely 17, eager to prove themselves. There were seasoned harpooners, wiry and strong, men whose shoulders bore the memory of every strike. There were cousins and brothers who had signed on together, comforted by familiar faces. There were even men with reputations already blackened who saw in this voyage a chance to outrun debts, crimes, or whispers. For many, the promise was not riches but survival. The wages of whaling were never generous, but they were steady. A share of oil at the voyage's end could mean food on the table, firewood in winter, and clothes for children. Even knowing that many would never return, men still signed on. Hunger at home was a certainty. Hunger at sea was at least a gamble. As the day of departure drew near, Provincetown prepared in its own grim way. Women sewed, packed, and prayed. Mothers clung to sons. Wives held husbands. Children waved wooden toys. The ministers offered blessings, invoking God's protection on the voyage. But behind every prayer was a shadow, the knowledge that not all those who walked down the dock would ever walk back again. The morning of departure was bitterly cold. Ice crusted the harbour, and the men's breath rose in clouds as they loaded their sea chests aboard. Salted beef, hardtack, dried peas, and barrels of water filled the hold. Harpoons were sharpened, ropes coiled, lanterns filled with oil. Harding inspected it all with the same calm he always carried, neither smiling nor scowling, simply noting what needed to be done. When the order was given, the Empress of the Waves pushed off from Provincetown harbour. Families stood on the docks, waving, shouting blessings, or weeping quietly. The ship's sails filled, creaking as the wind caught them. Slowly, the vessel slipped away from shore, her prow cutting through the grey water. The dunes and church spires shrank behind them until they were nothing but a line on the horizon. For those left behind, life would resume its usual pattern of waiting, mending nets, gathering driftwood, and watching the sea for sails that might not return for years. For those aboard, life narrowed to the planks beneath their feet and the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. At first, spirits were high. The men still sang at night, songs of home, songs of the hunt. They still joked, still shared stories. But even in those early days, some felt the creeping unease that always comes with leaving land behind. The sea is vast, and men are small, and once the coast disappeared, so too did the illusion of safety. None of them could have imagined how this voyage would end. They could picture storms, accidents, even death. Every sailor carried that possibility with him. But to picture themselves driven to hunger so deep They would carve and eat the flesh of their shipmates. That was beyond imagining. And yet, even as the Empress of the Waves cleared the harbor, her timbers creaking and her sails stretched tight, the shadow of that fate was already aboard. It rode with them, silent and unseen, waiting for its time. Once Provincetown faded into a thin line of sand and steeple, the men of the Empress of the Waves entered a world where only sea and sky existed. The horizon became their prison wall. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and time lost its meaning. What mattered was the rhythm of the bells, the commands of the captain, and the endless search for the spout of a whale. The ship's routine was relentless. At dawn, the men stumbled onto deck, faces still grey with sleep, to scrub the planks clean with seawater and sand. By mid-morning, they repaired sails, coiled ropes, sharpened harpoons. Every man had his task, and there was no room for idleness. The ocean punished slackers as surely as the captain did. At night, the crew collapsed into narrow bunks below deck, where the air was thick with the stink of salt sweat, damp wool, and the faint scurrying of rats. Privacy did not exist. The creak of timber, the slap of waves, and the coughs of restless men filled the dark. Meals were taken in silence more often than not. Salted beef hard enough to chip a tooth, hard tack crawling with weevils, and thin stew boiled from peas or rice. At the start of the voyage, barrels of fresh water tasted clean enough, but as months passed, they turned brackish, carrying the tang of mold. Sometimes the men joked about their food. Sometimes they spat it overboard in disgust. But mostly they forced it down. Hunger at sea was worse than bad taste. The first weeks saw fair weather, spirits were high, songs still echoed across the deck. The younger sailors tried to match the older men's tales of hunts gone by. They spoke of whales capsizing boats, of harpoon lines snapping men into the deep, of storms so fierce masts snapped like twigs. These were warnings dressed as stories, and the green hands laughed nervously, not yet knowing how close to truth the tales often ran. Then came their first whale. It was spotted just after dawn, a plume of white spray breaking the horizon. The cry went up, and small boats were lowered into the water, 6 men to an oar, their muscles straining as they rowed hard for the kill. The whale fought them for hours, dragging the boats miles before the harpoons finally found its heart. The sea turned red, gulls swarmed overhead, and when at last the great beast rolled belly up, the men cheered with a savagery born of exhaustion. For a moment they felt alive, triumphant, untouchable. They had proven themselves hunters, not prey, but that victory was fleeting. The carcass was brought alongside, stripped and boiled into oil. The stench clung to them, worked its way into their hair, their clothes, their skin. Even after washing, they could smell it in their dreams. Whaling was no noble work, it was butchery on the open sea, and once the oil was casked, once the meat was gone, the ocean offered no promise of the next kill. For weeks they saw nothing. no spouts, no fins, no sign of whales at all. The horizon stretched empty in every direction. Men began to mutter that the ocean was cursed, that the Empress herself carried bad luck. Harding enforced silence when complaints grew too loud, but silence only sharpened their thoughts. They watched the provisions dwindle, the bread harden, the beef rot in its barrel. They noticed how quickly water grew foul. Hunger had not yet arrived, but it had begun to circle them like a shark, unseen but present. Storms tested them next. In April, a gale tore across the deck, shredding sails and snapping rigging. Men were flung from their posts like dolls. One was swept overboard in the dark of night, his scream lost in the wind before anyone could throw a line. The logbook recorded him as lost to the sea, but among the crew his name lingered in whispers. He was the first. He would not be the last. Superstition grew stronger with each loss. Sailors nailed charms to the mast, carved crosses into the wood of their bunks, muttered prayers before sleep. Harding dismissed it all, but even he began to carry himself with greater stiffness, as if aware that something larger than storms or hunger had set its eye on them. By June, tempers flared easily. Small quarrels over ration sizes became fistfights. Men accused each other of hoarding, of stealing, of slacking. Harding punished the worst offenders with lashes. But even punishment could not restore trust once suspicion had taken root. The crew began to divide into small groups. Friends, cousins, men from the same village. Bonds grew tight in some places and snapped in others. One night, a harpooner named Joseph Brand fell ill. He coughed until his chest rattled, sweated through his clothes, and grew so weak he could barely stand. Harding ordered him confined below deck. Others whispered that his illness was a curse, punishment for the voyage itself. Within days, Joseph was gone. The log recorded consumption, but no burial at sea was noted. The men kept silent about what happened to his body. Later, long after the ship returned, rumors suggested that this was the first time flesh had been cut from bone, that hunger had already sunk its claws into the Empress of the waves. But at the time, no one dared speak it aloud. Still, the evidence was there. The food stores shrank faster than Harding's calculations predicted. Some men looked leaner than hunger alone could explain, their faces hollow, their eyes dark. When they passed each other in the dim light below deck, they glanced away quickly, as though guilty of something they could not admit. By midsummer, the voyage had already shifted from pursuit of whales to pursuit of survival. The barrels below deck were emptier than they should have been. The crew was thinner, hungrier, quieter, and the Atlantic showed no mercy. Storms still battered them, whales still eluded them, and every day the line between endurance and collapse thinned. The Empress of the waves was still afloat. Her masts still stood. Her captains still gave orders, but something unseen had already taken hold of her. Hunger was aboard, madness was aboard, and the men who had set out from Provincetown months earlier with laughter and song were already changing into something else. No one could see yet how far they would fall. No one could imagine the blood that would stain their decks before the voyage was done. But the signs were there, written in the silence, the suspicion, and the hollowness in every man's eyes. The backstory of the Empress of the Waves is not merely the tale of a whaling voyage, it is the slow tightening of a noose, the creeping weight of inevitability. By the time the ship left sight of land, their fate was already sealed. The only question was how long it would take for the sea and their own hunger to claim them. The summer of 1807 brought no mercy. The Empress of the Waves pressed deeper into the Atlantic, her sails patched and her rigging strained, but the ocean gave little in return. Whales were scarce, the provisions barrels grew lighter, and the men's bodies began to betray them. What had started as a whaling voyage was now turning into a battle of endurance against the sea itself. The signs of decline appeared slowly, almost too slowly for the men to notice at first. Bread crumbled into dust when broken. Beef, long salted, oozed brine and rot. Water stank of mold, forcing men to choke it down with pinched noses. Each mouthful was a test of willpower. They joked that even rats would turn away from their meals, but the laughter came thin, strained, and edged with bitterness. Storms became more frequent, hammering the ship with waves that sent her bow plunging into valleys of water before crashing upward again. Men clung to the rigging, knuckles white, as spray lashed their faces raw. One storm in July nearly ended the voyage outright. The mainmast split under the wind's fury, and Harding barked orders through the chaos, as though daring the storm to defy him. Men scrambled with hammers and rope, patching and binding with desperation. When the storm passed, 3 men were gone-swept into the Black Sea, their cries swallowed by the wind. The logbook recorded their names, their loss, and nothing more. No ceremony, no prayer. The crew had grown too numb for ritual. They were learning that death at sea was not a rare visitor, but an ever-present companion. With each loss, suspicion grew sharper. Men began to guard their rations more closely. Where once bread was shared freely, now it was counted, eyed, and hidden. Some accused others of hoarding. One sailor, caught sneaking extra hardtack, was lashed before the crew. Harding made the punishment public, his voice booming. "Steal from the ship, you steal from every man aboard." But even as the lashes cut into flesh, the lesson did not land. Hunger was stronger than fear. By August, weakness spread through the crew, faces hollowed, ribs showed beneath shirts, and coughs lingered longer than they should. Scurvy appeared, the gums of the sick swelling and bleeding until they could no longer chew the salted beef. Teeth fell out, one by one, dropping into the foul stew like stones. Harding tried to keep order, but even he could see his men were withering. The sea brought no relief. They sighted whales, but storms drove them off. They lowered boats, but harpoons missed or lines snapped. A few catches were made, but not enough. And the oil they rendered from those whales was more burden than blessing. It took fire and time to boil blubber, and the smoke carried over the waves, sickening men who already had little strength left. The stench clung to their skin, turning their stomachs until even the thought of food brought nausea. The first whispers of something darker began then. A man named Edward Blake fell ill, wasting until he could not rise from his bunk. He died one night, quietly, with no one at his side. The next morning, his body was gone. The log claimed he had been committed to the deep, but some swore no ceremony had been spoken, no splash heard. Instead, the men who shared Blake's bunkhouse returned to deck with faces pale and eyes that avoided questions. Whether it was true or not, the rumor spread like fire. Had they eaten him? Was that why they avoided looking others in the eye? The thought was unspeakable, but it clung to every whispered conversation. Men who had once labored side by side now measured each other not just as shipmates, but as potential prey. Harding sensed it too. He grew harsher, barking orders, punishing slights more quickly. He could feel the ship slipping from his control, not in sails or rigging, but in spirit. He had seen starvation before, in ports where men begged for crusts of bread, but he had never commanded men who might turn their hunger on each other. The weather worsened. Another storm struck in early September, battering the Empress until she creaked like a dying beast. Casks broke loose below deck, spilling what little remained of their provisions. When the crew scrambled to salvage what they could, they found barrels nearly empty. Salted meat spoiled, bread crawling with mold. The realization hit harder than the waves. They were nearly out of food. Harding rationed what remained, doling out crumbs where once there had been loaves. Men chewed leather straps, gnawed on scraps of rope, sucked on buttons just to trick their stomachs into believing they'd eaten it. Some boiled their shoes, scraping whatever broth they could from hardened leather. But nothing eased the gnawing ache. The logbook grew sparse. Entries once filled with notations of weather and whale sightings dwindled to single words. Calm storm, provisions low, and then, finally, desperation. By October, the men were gaunt, shadows of themselves. They staggered across deck with sunken eyes and trembling hands. Some lay in their bunks, too weak to rise, their breaths shallow and labored. The younger sailors, once filled with nervous laughter, now sat in silence, staring at the planks as though the wood itself might offer salvation, and then another death. A sailor named Thomas Ray collapsed on deck and did not rise. His body was carried below, and once again the log claimed he had been buried at sea. But whispers grew louder. Men claimed they had seen his body dragged not toward the rail, but toward the hold. That night, smoke rose from the galley stove, carrying with it a smell no one wanted to name. Some turned away in horror, others looked on with something like hunger. No one spoke of it openly, but all felt the shift. The line between men and beasts had begun to blur. The Empress of the Waves was no longer just a ship. She was becoming a cage. And inside that cage, hunger was sharpening its teeth. By late October, the men of the Empress of the Waves were scarcely recognizable as the same crew who had left Provincetown months earlier. Skin hung loose over their bones, eyes sunk into dark hollows, lips cracked and bleeding. Their hands, once steady on harpoons and ropes, now shook as they tried to perform the simplest tasks. Hunger had stripped them bare, leaving only instinct and desperation. The silence aboard the ship was nearly total. Where once songs had lifted into the night, now only the groan of timbers and the slap of waves could be heard. Even curses had grown rare. The men saved what little breath they had for surviving. Conversation reduced to muttered demands for water or food, and even those words were spoken with suspicion, as though asking for bread was an accusation. The rations had dwindled to almost nothing. Harding, grim-faced, had reduced each man's portion to crumbs. He counted every scrap, doled it with hands that trembled not from weakness, but from the weight of authority slipping away. Men began to stare at him differently, not with respect, but with calculation. He had his own stores. They were certain of it. Every captain did, and if he would not share them, then perhaps someone else would take them. Tension reached its breaking point one night when a sailor named Samuel Briggs confronted Harding. Briggs was gaunt, his voice raw, but his words were sharp. He accused Harding of keeping food locked in his cabin. Others, too weak to join, watched with wide eyes. Harding denied it, his voice iron, but when Briggs pushed forward, Harding struck him across the face with the butt of a pistol. Briggs collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. The men said nothing, but in their silence, Harding heard the truth. His control was gone. Fear might hold them for now, but hunger would break it soon. The next morning, Briggs was dead. Whether from the blow or from starvation, none could say. His body lay stiff on the deck, the crew circling it like wolves. Harding ordered it committed to the sea, but his voice faltered when no one moved. The men stared at the corpse, their hollow eyes lit with a terrible longing. For the first time, the hunger was stronger than the captain. That night, when the ship lay in silence, Briggs's body vanished. No splash was heard, no prayer was spoken. Only the faint smell of smoke from the galley, drifting across the deck, carried the truth. In the morning, the stove was cold, but scraps of burned flesh clung to its iron. Harding did not ask, and the men did not confess, but all of them knew the line had been crossed. Once that first barrier fell, the descent quickened. Men stopped speaking of the dead with reverence. Death became a resource. When Joseph Carter collapsed days later, his body was stripped before it was cold. Portions were roasted quietly in the galley. Others were salted and hidden in cloth bundles. Men who had once wept at the loss of a shipmate now watched hungrily, waiting for the next. The ship's log recorded none of this. Entries became more cryptic, reduced to single phrases. Another gone. Storm, no whales. But between the lines, the truth was written in silence. Fights broke out over the smallest scraps. One man, caught with a bundle of flesh, was beaten nearly to death by his shipmates. Another stabbed his bunkmate during the night. The sound of struggle muffled by the creak of the hull. Harding tried to intervene, but each act of violence left him weaker, less a captain than another starving man. Authority had no weight against the gnawing of the stomach. By November, half the crew was gone. Some died of illness, some from violence, some from simple collapse, but none were given to the sea. Their bodies stayed aboard, claimed by the living. At first, the men tried to cloak their acts in necessity. They spoke of survival, of God's will, of doing what must be done. But soon even those excuses faded. Hunger was reason enough. Those still alive grew strange in manner. Some muttered prayers constantly, clutching crosses carved into wood. Others fell into silence, eyes vacant, as though their minds had already left their bodies behind. A few grew wild, laughing at nothing, snarling like animals when approached. The ship itself seemed haunted, its timbers echoing not with work but with madness. Harding, once steady and commanding, aged years in weeks. His beard grew ragged, his skin yellowed, and his voice cracked when he gave orders. Some whispered that he too had eaten, though no one dared accuse him. A captain might lose authority, but he was still dangerous, still armed, still the last fragile thread of order. One night, a gale struck. Rain lashed the deck, waves towered higher than the mast, and lightning split the sky. Men too weak to hold lines were swept into the sea. Their screams vanished in thunder. Those who survived clung to the wreck of sails and rigging, eyes wild, knowing the storm had taken the last strength they had left. When dawn broke, the Empress of the waves was battered but afloat. Only 12 men remained. They gathered on deck, gaunt faces staring at each other, the storm's fury still ringing in their ears. In silence, they counted 12 left. Too many for the food that remained. Too few for the work a whaling ship required. The arithmetic was brutal, and hunger did the math for them. From then on, every man knew he was both sailor and meal. Eyes lingered too long on the weak. Knives were sharpened with quiet patience. The Empress had become not a ship, but a floating slaughterhouse, and somewhere deep in the belly of each man, the hunger whispered its command: live at any cost. The voyage had started with laughter, prayers, and promises of profit. Now it was reduced to this men staring at one another, waiting to see who would fall next, and who would eat. The line had been crossed. There was no turning back. By December of 1807, the Empress of the Waves was a ship adrift, not only on the ocean, but in the minds of her crew. The men who had left Provincetown as whalemen, hardened but human, were gone. What remained were shadows, gaunt and hollow, their bodies driven by hunger, and their eyes lit with a feverish light. The sea had not merely starved them, had unmade them. The 12 survivors who still clung to the deck no longer spoke of whales or wages. They spoke only of food, and though the word itself was rarely voiced, everyone knew what it meant. They had crossed the threshold weeks earlier when Samuel Briggs's body disappeared into the galley stove. Since then, death had not been an end, but a harvest. At first, they took only the dead, those who collapsed from weakness or illness. It was easier that way less guilt, less blood. But hunger is a patient teacher, and it whispers that waiting is wasteful. Soon, the men began to measure each other with new eyes, noting who was weakest, who was closest to collapse, who might not resist when the time came. The first deliberate killing happened on a night when the wind was calm and the sea unnervingly still. A sailor named Daniel Foster had grown too weak to rise from his bunk. His breath rattled in his chest, and his eyes stared blankly at the beams overhead. Two of his bunkmates, men who had once called him friend, decided the wait was over. In the dim light of a lantern, they pressed a rag over his mouth and nose until his body stopped struggling. When the lantern gutted out moments later, the only sound was the creak of the hull and the beating of their own hearts. By dawn, Foster's body was stripped and portioned. Some recoiled in horror, refusing to take part, but most did not. Hunger had eaten away shame. The galley stove burned again, smoke curling up into the pale morning sky, carrying with it a smell that was no longer mistaken for anything else. From that day forward, the Empress of the Waves became a slaughterhouse. The killings grew more brazen. Men no longer waited for night, nor for weakness. Arguments ended not with fists, but with knives. A harsh word could mean death, and death meant food. Each man knew he might be next, and so each grew more violent, more desperate to prove strength. Weakness was no longer a misfortune, it was a death sentence. Harding tried to keep order, but the crew no longer saw him as captain. His commands went unheeded, his punishment ignored. Some claimed he had eaten as well, though whether by choice or necessity, none could say. If he did, he never admitted it. But his silence was damning enough. The line between leader and accomplice blurred until nothing remained of the authority he once held. The ship itself bore witness to the horror. Blood stained the deck where bodies had been butchered. Bones, stripped bare, were tossed carelessly overboard, bobbing in the waves before sinking into the depths. The galley stove, once used for boiling whale blubber, now carried the stink of human fat. Its iron blackened by the fires of survival. Paranoia consumed the survivors. They slept in shifts, knives clutched in trembling hands, eyes darting at every sound. Some tried to form alliances. Groups of 2 or 3 bound by fear more than loyalty, but alliances dissolved quickly, broken by suspicion or hunger. A man who trusted another today might find a knife at his throat tomorrow. The winter storms did not cease. Waves smashed against the hull, rain lashed the deck, and lightning split the sky in jagged arcs. The men huddled below, gnawing on their portions, while above them the ship moaned like a living creature in agony. They no longer prayed for the storm to pass. Prayer had been abandoned long ago. Now they prayed only that they would be the ones to survive it. By the turn of the year, only 8 men remained. Their bodies were twisted by starvation, yet they clung to life with a ferocity that bordered on madness. Some had grown silent, staring blankly into space. Others muttered constantly, words half prayers, half curses. One man laughed at nothing, his voice high and cracked, the sound sending chills through those who listened. It was then that the killings became ritualized, no longer accidents of violence or moments of desperation. They became deliberate, planned acts. Lots were drawn, straws cut from scraps of rope. The man who drew the shortest knew his fate. He was held down by the others, his throat cut with a sailor's knife, his blood drained into a bucket. Flesh was portioned evenly, each man taking his share. They justified it with words like fairness and necessity, but beneath those words lay the truth. The sea had turned them into executioners. The ritual brought no peace. If anything, it deepened the madness. Each man now lived with the knowledge that survival depended not just on strength, but on luck. Each meal was seasoned with fear, each bite chewed with the awareness that the same fate might soon be theirs. And yet, they ate. They had no choice. The hunger was too strong, the body too demanding. They ate, and in eating, they became something less than men. By February, storms had battered the Empress into near ruin. Her sails hung in tatters, her rigging frayed, her hull groaning with every wave. The men who remained staggered across her deck like ghosts, their faces pale, their eyes haunted. They had survived, but at a cost so great it could never be measured. It was then that the final betrayal came. Harding, who had clung to his role as captain even as it slipped from him, was attacked in his cabin. The men burst through the door, knives flashing in the dim light. Harding fought, pistol in hand, but he was too weak, too outnumbered. His blood stained the floorboards, his body dragged to the galley like so many before him. The last barrier had fallen. The captain was dead, consumed by the very men he had once commanded. The Empress of the Waves was no longer a whaling ship. She was a coffin adrift, a vessel crewed by cannibals who had devoured their own leader. When Captain Elias Harding fell beneath the knives of his own crew, the last thread of order snapped. His pistol was taken, his body portioned, and his name spoken only once more, in a whisper that carried no reverence. With him gone, the Empress of the Waves became a floating adrift, leaderless, ruled only by hunger and the unsteady hands of those who remained. 7 men were left, each one gaunt, skeletal, but still breathing. And breathing, in their world, meant consuming. They divided Harding's flesh as they had done with others, each man clutching his share with trembling hands, devouring it quickly, as though afraid the others might snatch it away. His bones were cracked for marrow, his fat rendered in the galley stove. The captain who had once commanded them now sustained them. It was survival in its rawest form, stripped of all pretense. The killing of Harding brought no satisfaction. If anything, it deepened the madness. He had been a figure of authority, a wall, however, fragile between the men and chaos. Without him, paranoia reigned. Every glance was mistrusted, every word questioned. The alliances that had formed dissolved as quickly as they had been made. Each man became a solitary creature, guarding his meager strength against all others. The storms did not relent. Winter seas battered the Empress, her hull groaning with each wave. The sails hung in tatters, patched and repatched until they were little more than rags. The rigging frayed ropes, snapping like gunfire in the wind. Yet somehow the ship remained afloat, a battered coffin carrying its damned cargo through the grey Atlantic. The men rarely worked her now. The routine of whaling was long abandoned. They did not mend sails unless the need was dire, did not pump the bilges unless the water threatened to drown them. They conserved every ounce of strength, hoarding it like treasure. Their only true labor was death waiting for it, hastening it, and feasting when it arrived. Another fell soon after Harding. William Carver, a harpooner, collapsed on deck one bitter morning, his body too frail to rise again. The others gathered around him, not to help, but to watch. His breaths grew shallower, each one a countdown. When the last left his lips, knives were drawn, and the ritual repeated. Flesh carved, portions divided, bones tossed into the sea. The gulls circled above, shrieking, but dared not descend. 6 remained. By now, the men had ceased even pretending at fairness. Where once lots had been drawn, now strength decided. The strongest took first. The weakest were left scraps. Fights erupted over choice cuts, knives flashing in the dim light. Blood stained the deckboards, sticky and dark, joining the stains already there. The Empress smelled not of salt and tar, but of smoke, grease, and decay. The ship became a place of whispers. Men spoke to themselves, muttering prayers or curses, their minds slipping away from reason. One claimed to hear the voices of those they had eaten, whispering in the creak of the timbers and the moan of the rigging. Another carved crosses into the mast with a dull knife, as though splintered wood could hold back damnation. A third laughed constantly, high and brittle, until the sound drove the others to near madness. Weeks blurred together. Days passed without measure. The men could not have said what month it was, or how long they had been adrift. Time had lost meaning. The only calendar was the count of survivors, a number that grew smaller with each passing death. 5, then 4. When 3 remained, the killings grew open. No more waiting for weakness, no more hesitation. One night, a man named Isaac Morton awoke to find the others crouched above him, knives in hand. He struggled, screamed, but his voice carried only to the sea. By dawn he was gone, his bones rolling in the scuppers picked clean. 2 men were left. John Palmer and Henry Drew, both gaunt, both mad, both clinging to life by threads too thin to hold. They circled each other across the deck like predators, too weak to fight, too desperate to trust. Neither slept deeply, knives clutched even in slumber. Their eyes never left each other, watching, waiting. It ended when Palmer made the first move. A lunge, a slash, a scream carried on the wind. Drew fell, blood spilling across the planks. Palmer, trembling, half insane, did what all before him had done. He carved, ate, and survived. Now only one remained. John Palmer drifted alone on the Empress of the waves, surrounded by the ghosts of his crew. He spoke to them in the night, answering questions only he could hear. He carried Harding's pistol, though the powder was damp and the flint dull. He staggered across the deck, bones sharp beneath his skin, eyes hollow but still alive. The ship stank of blood, smoke, and salt, a stench so strong it clung to the very sails. It was in this state that the Empress of the Waves limped back toward Provincetown harbour in February of 1807, a ship of death, carrying a single survivor whose body bore the evidence of every horror. His face was skeletal, his hands trembling, his voice broken. When asked later what had happened, he gave only one answer. The sea made us do it. But the sea had not carved the flesh of his shipmates. The sea had not boiled their bones or portioned their bodies. That had been the men themselves. Ordinary men, whalemen of Provincetown, turned by hunger into cannibals. And though Palmer walked ashore, his survival was no triumph. He was a living corpse, a ghost wearing flesh. The town recoiled from him, mothers clutching children, ministers crossing themselves. They had seen shipwrecks before, but never this. The Empress of the Waves was abandoned, at dock, left to rot. Her timbers carried the stain of death, too deep to be scrubbed clean. Some said her planks groaned at night, as though remembering the screams of the men who had died upon them. Others swore gulls would not land upon her, as though even carrion birds feared the curse she carried. John Palmer did not live long after his return. Some said he died of fever. Others whispered he wasted away, eaten from within by the guilt of what he had done. A few swore they saw him wandering the dunes at night, muttering to himself, calling the names of the dead. Whether those sightings were truth or rumor, none could say. The story of the Empress of the Waves was buried quickly. Provincetown was a small town, and scandal could ruin it. But bones do not lie, and journals do not rot as quickly as guilt. Enough fragments survived records, whispers, and the testimony of one broken man to preserve the truth. That a ship once sailed from Provincetown with 24 men. That it returned with one pat, that the hunger of the sea is endless, and that sometimes it teaches men to feed it with one another. When the Empress of the Waves staggered back into Provincetown harbour, her sails tattered, her timbers worn, and her crew reduced to one gaunt figure, the town fell silent. Word spread fast. Fishermen saw the ship first, then boys on the docks ran shouting through the crooked streets. "The Empress is back! The Empress is back!" But when people gathered, their joy withered. What returned was not a ship of triumph, but a coffin. John Palmer stumbled down the gangplank alone, eyes hollow, body trembling, his clothes hung in rags, his skin stretched tight across bones. He could barely walk, and when he spoke, his words were little more than whispers. Mothers clutched children closer, men turned their faces away, and even the gulls circled warily overhead. The first thing noticed was the smell. It clung to Palmer's clothes, his hair, his very skin, the stink of grease and smoke, of something cooked that should never have been cooked. Men who had gutted whales, who had stood knee-deep in blubber and blood, swore they had never smelled anything like it. One fisherman muttered a single word under his breath: "Human." The authorities questioned Palmer. Of course, Captain Harding was gone, the crew gone, the ship nearly wrecked. What had happened? Palmer's answers were fragmented, inconsistent. He spoke of storms, of illness, of starvation. When pressed, he rasped the same phrase again and again. "The sea made us do it." Some took that as madness, the raving of a man broken by hunger. But others heard the truth beneath it, and they shuddered. The Empress was searched reluctantly. What the townsmen found only deepened the unease. The galley stove was black with grease, scraps of charred flesh clinging to its edges. Bones cracked open for marrow lay hidden in corners, some tossed into barrels, some rolling in the skit. A few still bore the marks of knives. No whales had been taken, no oil casks filled. The only harvest on that voyage had been themselves. The elders of Provincetown moved quickly. The town was small, its reputation fragile. Already outsiders mocked it as a place of poor soil and poorer men. If word spread that its whalemen had eaten one another, the shame would stain every family, every child born there. So they ordered silence. The ministers preached forgiveness, urging townsfolk to see Palmer not as a monster, but as a victim of the CS cruelty. The constable wrote his report in careful words. Crew diminished by hardship, survivor delivered to shore. Nothing more. But silence cannot smother whispers. Taverns buzzed with rumor. Fishermen who had gone aboard the Empress told their wives, who told their neighbors. Bones, they said, bones cracked open and boiled. A stove that smelled of human fat. And a man who could not meet another's eyes without flinching. Soon the whispers spread beyond Provincetown. Sailors carried the tale to New Bedford, Nantucket, and Boston. Merchants repeated it in Salem and Portsmouth. By spring, the story of the cannibal crew was known across New England, told in low voices over tankards of ale. Always the same refrain. The Provincetown men ate each other. For Palmer, there was no peace. He tried to live among the town, but people recoiled from him. Children pointed, men crossed the street to avoid his gaze. Women whispered when he passed. In church, he sat alone. The ministers offered him grace, but their eyes betrayed unease. He was not merely a survivor. He was a reminder, living proof of what men could become when hunger stripped them bare. Palmer wasted away in the months after his return. Some said fever took him. Others claimed he refused to eat, that he could no longer bear the act of swallowing. Still others whispered that guilt consumed him more thoroughly than hunger ever had. He died quietly, without family at his side, and his burial was quick, his grave unmarked. Provincetown did not want a monument to its shame. The ship herself fared little better. The Empress of the waves was left tied at dock, her timbers reeking, her decks stained. No one wanted to crew her again. Superstitious men claimed she was cursed, haunted by the voices of the dead. At night, they said, screams echoed from her galley, and the smell of burning flesh rose from her cold stove. Eventually, the owners sold her for scrap. Her planks were torn up, her bones scattered, much like the men who had once sailed her. But destruction could not erase memory. The story lingered. Families of the lost demanded answers that never came. Wives asked where their husbands' bodies were, only to be told they had been given to the sea. Children grew up hearing whispers that their fathers had been eaten by their friends. And for those who lived in Provincetown, shame hung over every meal, every prayer, every trip to see S. This was the aftermath of the cannibal crew, not just the death of men, but the death of innocence. Provincetown would forever carry the weight of what happened on that ship, no matter how hard it tried to bury it. News of the Empress of the waves spread beyond Provincetown like smoke caught in the wind. Sailors carried it from harbour to harbour, their voices low, their faces grave. In New Bedford, men whispered of the Provincetown cannibals. In Nantucket taverns, the tale was retold with horror and fascination. By the time it reached Boston, it had already grown into legend. The details shifted with every telling. Some said the crew drew lots to decide who would die. Others swore they murdered one another in madness, knife against knife, until only one remained. A few claimed that Palmer himself had killed them all, feasting on his shipmates like a demon of the sea. The truth, buried in silence and shame, became inseparable from rumor. But the core remained unchanged. A whaling ship had gone to sea with 24 men and returned with one, and that one bore the stink of human flesh. The shipping companies feared the story more than storms. Whaling was already a brutal trade, its profits slim and its dangers many. Tales of cannibalism threatened to make men think twice before signing their names on shipping papers. In Boston, owners and agents dismissed the rumors as tavern gossip, insisting the men had died of fever, of storm, of ordinary hardship. But no denials could drown the whispers. In Provincetown, the elders doubled their efforts to bury the past. Families were warned not to speak of it. Ministers preached sermons about endurance, about faith in the face of trial, urging the town to look forward, not back. But none could silence the fishermen who had smelled the galley stove, who had seen the cracked bones tossed aside, and none could silence the children who whispered the tale at night, daring one another to say the names of the dead. The stigma clung hardest to the families of the crew. Wives of the lost were pitied, yes, but also shunned. It was whispered that their husbands had been eaten, that their blood ran in the veins of the survivor. Children grew up marked by that shame, mocked in the streets as sons and daughters of cannibals. Some left Provincetown, seeking new lives in Boston or New York, where the shadows of the Empress would not follow them. Others stayed, but carried the wound in silence. As years passed, the tale faded from public speech, though never from memory. It was too dark, too shameful to be spoken of openly. But it lived in the margins, in journals, hidden in attics, in the muttered warnings of old sailors, in the haunted look of women who had waited on the docks for men who never returned. The sea had claimed many before, but never like this. In time, the story became cautionary. Parents warned children not to stray too close to the harbor at night, lest the ghosts of the Empress pull them aboard. Sailors told green hands that hunger at sea was a beast greater than storms or whales, and that men who fed it lost more than their lives. And in every retelling, one detail returned. The survivor, John Palmer, muttering again and again, "The sea made us do it." Historians of later years found the traces, shipping records marked with evasive words. A logbook fragment stained with grease, parish records, noting the sudden deaths of so many men in 1807, and though the elders had tried to erase it, enough remained to piece together the outline of the truth. Not every detail, not every name, but enough to know the Empress of the Waves had indeed returned with fewer men than she left, and the survivor had indeed carried the shadow of cannibalism. Provincetown changed after that voyage. It did not stop sending men to sea whaling, was still its lifeblood, but it never looked at its ships the same way again. Every departure was tinged with unease, every return greeted with relief that quickly turned to scrutiny. Was this ship whole? Was its crew intact? Were its barrels filled with oil and its men unbroken? Or had hunger once again feasted where the whales had not? The story lingered in ways even silence could not erase. When bones washed ashore in later years, fishermen wondered aloud if they belonged to whales or to men. When storms battered ships, wives prayed not just for their husbands' lives, but for their humanity. And in the darkest nights, when the wind howled through the dunes and the sea roared against the shore, some swore they heard voices on the air, the cries of the lost crew, calling for help that never came. The tale of the Empress of the Waves was buried, but never gone. It became part of the town's marrow, a truth too monstrous to acknowledge yet too powerful to forget. Generations later, people still whispered it over ale, still warned newcomers not to ask too many questions, because every family in Provincetown had been touched by it, in blood or in shame. The aftermath was not only the death of men at sea, it was the death of innocence on land. A reminder that the ocean does not merely drown or freeze or starve, it devours. And sometimes it makes men devour themselves. The story of the Empress of the Waves begins like so many whaling voyages of its time, with hope, with hunger for profit, with men hardened by necessity and bound by duty. It ends as few voyages in history ever have, with bones cracked for marrow, with blood spilled not by whale or storm, but by human hands, and with one man walking ashore carrying the weight of 24 ghosts. From the moment she left Provincetown, the ship was already cursed by the odds. Provisions spoiled, storms battered her, whales eluded her, and hunger gnawed at her crew until it hollowed them out. But hunger does more than eat at the body. It eats at trust, at conscience, at the fragile web that binds men together in common cause. When Samuel Briggs vanished into the galley stove, when Daniel Foster was smothered in his bunk, when Captain Harding himself fell beneath knives, the sea had revealed its cruelest lesson. Survival is never without cost. The town tried to bury the truth. Records were smudged, sermons preached forgiveness, silence demanded of families who had lost too much already. But silence cannot erase memory. The smell of that galley stove lingered. The sight of bones tossed aside haunted fishermen's dreams. The whispers carried down coasts, across taverns, through harbours, until the tale of Provincetown's cannibal crew became part of New England's shadowed history. It is tempting, more than 2 centuries later, to look at them with horror alone, to call them monsters, to dismiss them as men who abandoned decency, who crossed a line no one should ever cross. And yet, pause, what would you have done adrift for months, starving, your body collapsing, your mind unraveling? Would you cling to dignity, letting yourself waste away? Or would you listen to the hunger clawing at your insides, whispering that one bite might mean one more day? History gives us easy distance, but the sea never allowed such comfort. The men of the Empress were not creatures from a nightmare. They were fathers, sons, neighbors. They left home with songs on their lips and prayers in their hearts. And when the ocean stripped them bare, when the storms left them broken, when the bread turned to dust and the barrels ran dry, they became what hunger made of them. That is the true horror, not that they were monsters, but that they were men. Provincetown bore the wound in silence. Ships still sailed, children still grew, ministers still preached. But the memory of the Empress never left. In every departure, families prayed not only for safe return, but for safe hearts. In every storm, they feared not just drowning, but damnation. And in every tavern, when the story was whispered, men stared into their ale and asked themselves, would I have done differently? The Empress of the Waves rotted at dock, then was broken apart, her planks scattered. But no ship is ever truly gone, just as no story is ever truly buried. The wood may be ash, the men may be bones, but the truth drifts still in the salt air of Cape Cod. Fishermen swear that on cold February nights the harbour carries a stench, not of fish, not of whale, but of smoke and fat. And some say if you stand alone on the dunes and listen to the wind, you can hear voices crying from the sea, the voices of men who sailed away as whalemen and returned as something else. Tonight, we have walked their path. From Provincetown's crooked streets, to the storm-tossed deck of the Empress, to the silence of her return. We have seen how hunger transforms, how the sea takes more than lives, how desperation can blur the line between man and beast. What remains is a question that cannot be answered, only asked. When hunger comes true hunger, the kind that strips away everything you think you are, what would you do? Would you starve with dignity? Or would you feed the fire one more time, even if the only fuel left was human flesh? The sea keeps her secrets, but some she returns. And this one she gave back not in oil or profit, but in horror. The Empress of the waves may have vanished, but her story remains. Carved into the marrow of New England's memory, a warning, a curse, a mirror held up to the darkest parts of ourselves. So when you next stand by the shore and hear the waves, remember, the sea does not only drown, it tempts, it consumes. And sometimes it leaves men alive, but changed forever. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If you've felt the chill of it, if the echoes of the Empress stay with you tonight, let me know where you're re-listening from and how late it is in your corner of the world. These stories are shadows we walk through together, and there are more waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into history's darkest waters. Because the sea has many graves, and not all of them stay buried.